Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you how you can turn an HTML game into a mobile application. For this, I'm going to be using React Native. If you're unfamiliar with React Native, it's basically a tool that lets you build cross-platform mobile applications for iOS and Android using JavaScript and Typescript. By the end of this video, you'll have this block tower game, which I'm sure you've probably seen before. This game is completely written with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And we'll be storing our high score locally on the device so that every time you open and play the app, the high score will be persistent and only update when you reach a new one. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is create a new React Native project called HTML Mobile Game. This will take a bit to set up and install our dependencies, but once it's done, we'll open it up with VS Code. And we'll go ahead and try to run this project. Inside of the project, you're going to want to run command npm start. This will start our dev server for us using Metro. Then we can open up Xcode in Android Studio. As you can see, I'm already getting an error with Android Studio, which is usually the case. There's typically more hurdles trying to run an Android than there is with iOS. But to fix the error, we can open up build.gradle and add this wrapper task that it's complaining about. We'll go ahead and launch our Android emulator, and in parallel, we'll start our iOS project in Xcode. We'll just change our simulator to be an iPhone 13 Pro, and we can just click the play button to start running. Coming back to Android, we have another error that we'll fix in a second. Let's just wait and see if iOS gives us any trouble. And no, it's pretty straightforward. As you can see, we have the app running on iOS now. Before we go back to Android, I wanted to share the sponsor of this video, Dropshop, a platform that offers creators easy to use digital assets for their video content. This is a startup project that I've been working on for a little while now. So if you want some awesome drag and drop animations for your videos, consider checking us out at drop-shop.io. Use code dev-less for 30% off your first purchase. So coming back to Android, to fix the next error, we're again going to go into build.gradle, and we'll just add an empty task called prepare Kotlin build script model. Not saying this is the best approach to fix this issue, but it's a way to get around it. At least now the Gradle sync isn't throwing any errors, so we can click the play button to try to run the app. And another error, this time with our SDK location. For this one, you're going to want to go back to VS Code, and inside your Android folder, we'll create a local.properties file. Inside, we'll add a variable sdk.dir, and we'll set it to the path to our Android SDK, which should be pretty much the same for you. Just change the path to use your user. And finally, we're able to run the Android app. Next, we're going to install a few dependencies, React Native FS, React Native Static Server, and React Native WebView. And you're going to make sure you have these installed in your package.json. Next, I'm going to comment this line out in my linter file. This is completely optional, but it basically gives me errors if I don't format stuff correctly, which is good practice to have, but it's kind of annoying, and for this video, I really don't need it. Then we're going to remove a lot of the code in our app file that we really won't need. We'll just leave this safe area view, and we'll add our own style, flex1, just so it expands all across the screen. We can also remove these other style constants and these React Native component imports. We'll also add this useEffect and useState import and remove the props with children one. And we'll go ahead and add our 3 dependencies we installed. And then again, we'll probably use this text component so we can add it back to the imports. So as you can see, we're getting an error with the static server dependency. For this, we're gonna want to create a folder called typings in the root of our project and add an index.d.ts file. And then inside this file, we'll declare module React Native Static Server to fix this error. Now we're going to go ahead and add our game files into the mix. So here we have our game running in the browser. I didn't make this game, I just found the repository for it, which I'll link in the description if you want to check it out. I did change and add a few things in the files that I'm going to be using for this demo, but if you want to grab these, they'll be in the repo for this project together with the rest of the code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called assets, and inside I'm going to drop my www folder with all the files needed to run the game. Here we have our HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files, along with 2 additional JavaScript files for dependencies that are used uh, to run this game. Now jumping back into our app file, we're going to add a view component. We'll set the height and width to 100%. Inside of here, we'll add our WebView component, which is basically like an iframe if you've ever used one of these in web development. But just to make sure everything's working, we'll add a URL to display a web page. I'll just test this out with this channel's URL. I also forgot to remove these imports that we won't need, so I'll go ahead and remove those. We'll try to run this really quickly in iOS to make sure it works. And we got an error saying WebView is undefined, which is weird because we installed the dependencies and we aren't seeing any errors in the app file, but actually we forgot to update our pod dependencies, and that's why we're getting this error. So to update them, we can run the pod install command from inside the iOS file, and that'll update our iOS project dependencies. Now if you try to run again, it should work. And it does. We're able to see that our web view is working. So now we're going to work on passing our files for the HTML game. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a static server inside of our app to serve our files. And then we're going to point to that server via the web view. So let's start. First, we're going to create a function called getPath. And here, based on the OS of the device, we're going to return a different path. So if it's an Android device, we return rnfs.document directory path plus our path to that www folder. And then for iOS, we return rnfs.main bundle path plus the www folder. Next, let's create a function called move Android files. This will be needed for the Android devices. What we'll do is make a directory on Android using the document directory path plus /www. Then we'll make an array object called files with the path to all our files inside of the www folder. We'll loop through this array, and for each file, we'll copy it to that directory that we created on the Android device. Then we're going to use the useEffect hook to call these functions. First, move Android files. Then we'll store the value returned from the getPath function into a variable called path. Now the move Android file function will handle adding these game files to the Android device, but for iOS, we're going to come back to Xcodes and right click on our project. Then we're going to select add files to HTML mobile game. From here, we're going to select the assets folder and the W folder with all our game assets, and we'll click on add. You should see our www folder with all of our game files in Xcode. Now back in the useEffect hook, we're gonna create a server by creating a variable called server and setting it equal to new static server, and we'll pass in port 8080 and the path we get from the getPath function. Then we can type server.start.then and we'll get the URL for our static server. So, but we need to store this value somewhere. So we're going to create a constant called server URL and a setter function called set URL, and we'll initially set it to use state null. Then we can come back to server.start.then and use the set URL function to set our URL. Then we'll also add a return inside useEffect so we can stop the server when on mounting the component if our server is running. Logic inside this useEffect should only run when the component first mounts, and the logic inside the return will run when the component unmounts. Now, coming back to the WebView, we'll pass the server URL as our source, but we get an error. And this is because our server URL is initially set to null with useState, so we need to add some logic. If our server URL is null, we just display/return text saying hello world. And if not, then we'll return our WebView. We'll also add style flex 1 to our WebView just to make sure it stretches the whole screen of the device. Now let's try running in iOS and see if it works. It is working. Cool. Now we have our game up on iOS, but we still want to display our high score and store it in the device so we can remember and try to beat it the next time we play the game. So coming back to our game files, and in our index.html, we're going to add a div with a class called high-score, and inside we'll add the text high score followed by another div that we'll use to display the value. For now, we'll set it to 0, and we'll also set the ID to high-score. Now we'll go to the style.css file, and we'll add a new style class for the high score component. Now if we run in the browser, we can see the text high score at the top left of the screen, and I'll switch it to mobile screen so that we can get a better idea of what it will look like on a device. Our value is a bit too close to the text, so to fix that, we'll just add a style in the div element and just set that to margin left 10 pixels. So that looks better. Now we need to go inside our index.js file for the game, and inside the game class we're going to add a variable called high score using this.highscore. We'll set that equal to 0. We'll also add this.highscore container, and we'll set that equal to document.getElementById high-score. This will hold our div element where we'll hold the value of the high score. Next, let's come down to the bottom. Uh, Inside of this end game function, we'll add some logic that checks if this.highscore is less than this.blocks.length minus 2. Then we set this.highscore to this.blocks.length minus 2. We have to do minus 2 because of how the game was set up, but basically saying if we have a new high score, update to that high score value. We'll also need to update our high score container.innerHTML equal to this.highscore converted to a string. Now, if we try to play the game in the browser, we can see it's updating the new high score, but when we refresh the page, it resets it to 0. This is because we're not really storing the value anywhere, but we'll get to that in a minute. I also want to display a message when we get a new high score. So let's go back to index.html, and under our game over header, we'll add a paragraph element that says new high score along with a celebration emoji. We'll set the ID for this element to new-high-score, and we'll add style display none so that it doesn't show the message. Of course, we want to show the message, but only when we get a new high score. So back into index.js, we'll add a new high score variable and set it to the element we just created using get element by ID. Then back in the endgame function at the bottom, we'll add if high score is greater than 0, we'll set the display style of our new high score to be a block display. This will just pretty much show the message if we get a new high score. We'll also have to go to restart game function and set the display of the new high score element back to none when a new game starts, or else it'll continue to display the message. Now in the browser, let's make sure everything works. We get a new high score of 5 and we see the message, but when we get a high score of 2, it doesn't show the message, so it's working. Now we're going to start working on locally storing our high score. To do this, we need to install another dependency called React Native Async Storage. Let's make sure when we install this dependency, we also install the pods by running the pod install inside of our iOS folder. In Xcode, you'll get a pop-up after updating pods, and we can just click on read from disk. Now let's go back to our app.tsx file, and then here we're going to import async storage. Then we're going to add another constant called high score with a setter function called set high score, and we'll use state and set that to 0. Next, we'll create a new async function called store data that takes in a value as a parameter that's a string, and we'll add a try catch block inside. Inside try, we'll type await async storage dot set item, and we'll pass two parameters. First, the name of the item that we're storing, which will be high dash score, then the value parameter. Then we create a second async function called get data. This will be very similar to the set data function, except it won't take in a parameter, and we'll use the async storage.get item function instead. And we'll just pass in the name of the item we want to get the value for. So again, it'll be the same name we had in set item, high dash score. Here's where we'll set our high score constant that we created via set high score function, only if the value returned from the get item isn't null. Then inside of useEffect, we can call get data. So when the app initializes, it'll see if we have a high score stored in the app locally, and if so, we can set it to our high score constant. So now we have a way to retrieve our stored data, but how are we going to set it when we get a new high score in the HTML game? This is where we're going to use a property of a WebView called onMessage. We'll go ahead and add it to our WebView and pass in a onMessage function that we'll create. For this onMessage function, it's going to take in an event parameter. Then it's going to grab the data from this event by creating a data constant and setting it equal to json.parse event.nativeEvent.data. So this will grab and parse the data from the event. Then we'll check if the data has a high score property. If so, we'll add a console.log just to be able to see the new high score and store it with our store data function. To trigger this event, we'll go back into index.js for the HTML game, and in the endgame function, we'll type window.reactnativewebview.postMessage, and inside we'll say json.stringify, and we'll pass in a object with a property high score set to this.highscore. And let's test this out in iOS. I ran across a weird issue in iOS where my game files were getting cached in the simulator and not updating with my recent changes. Even if I deleted the app, what I had to end up doing is erase all content and settings for the simulator and then rerun the app, and this did the trick for me. So we can see that the app is running, and we can see the changes we added for the high score. And when we get a high score of 3, we can see the logs that says new high score, and it's the value we got. So we can see that the data is successfully passed from the HTML game to our React Native app. And to make sure it's storing, we can also add a console.log inside of the getData function that'll print out our stored high score. And it's printing out 3, so we know it's storing it correctly. But I'm not sure why it's printing it out more than once. And after a bit of digging into this, I realized that I forgot to add the empty array in our use effect, which is what makes it run when the component first mounts. So that fixed our log being printed multiple times. Something else you might have noticed is that even though we're printing our stored value from the React Native side of things, we're not updating the high score for the game. And this is because we're not really passing any data to the game from the React Native side. So we are only receiving data from the HTML game. We're not really passing our stored high score when the game first starts up. And the way we can pass data to the game is by using another WebView property called inject JavaScript, which lets us pass JavaScript to the WebView. And what we can do is create a constant called inject underscore JS. And then here we're gonna use the backticks or template strings to interpolate our high score variable into our JavaScript code. You need to make sure that you type this correctly because this string will be converted to JavaScript. What we're gonna do is add a message event listener that sets our high score ID element inner HTML to the message data. Then under this event listener, we're gonna make the event call by adding window.postMessage, and we'll pass in our high score variable. And under this, we need to add true. Coming back to our index.js, something else that we need to do is update the high score value because initially it's set to 0. We need to update it with the data that we have locally stored on the app. And to do this, we can just parse in our high score containers in our HTML, and that should do the trick. Then we can come back to the web view and we'll first set JavaScript enable property to true. Then we can pass the inject.js constant for the injected JavaScript property. Now if we rerun the app, we can now see that our high score is being set to 3, which is the value that we had stored locally. And if we get a new high score of 4, we can stop and rerun the app and see that our stored high score was updated to 4. So it's persistent and stored locally, and everything seems to be working. Coming back to Android, you might experience a few issues if you try to run the app, and mainly caused by the static server dependency that we installed. I've added a patches folder to fix these issues, and if you're seeing the same issues, you can grab the folder from the project repo and drop it into your own project. The easiest way to apply these patches is by going to package.json and adding a post install script that runs npx patch package command. Then you would run npm install and it should apply the patches for you. Additionally, we'll need to also go to our build.gradle file inside of Android folder and add this subproject for the React Native static server dependency. Also, you're going to want to go to the app folder inside of Android and add this line to the bottom of the Android section in the build.gradle file. This is to allow us to access our game assets. And that should do it for Android. If you have any questions or run into any problems, leave a comment and I'll try my best to help out. Thank you very much for tuning in, and until next time.